The morning sun of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the crystal spires of the Galactic Academy. Students from dozens of worlds walked through the corridors, their various forms creating a living rainbow of alien diversity. Some floated, some crawled, and others moved in ways that defied easy description. In Classroom 7 Alpha, the xenobiology students settled into their seats. The room buzzed with nervous energy as Professor Veltar arranged his teaching materials. The tall Etherian moved with fluid grace, his translucent skin shimmering in the artificial light. His large, dark eyes surveyed the classroom with the patience of someone who had taught for over 2 centuries. Zara, a young Etherian student, sat in the front row. Her gill slits fluttered nervously as she prepared her note-taking device. Like most of her species, she was gentle and curious, evolved from peaceful filter feeders on a world with no large predators. The concept of violence was as foreign to her as breathing water was to most other species. Behind her sat Kevin, a nautiloid, from the ocean world of Aquatica Prime. His environmental suit maintained the proper pressure and humidity for his squid-like body. His large, intelligent eyes moved independently as he scanned the room. The nautiloids were ancient and wise, but their soft bodies had never known the harsh realities of predation. They had evolved intelligence as their primary defense, living in the deep oceans where few creatures could threaten them. The granite students occupied the back corner, their rock-like bodies motionless and patient. These silicon-based life forms from the mineral-rich world of Petra had never needed to fear anything. They simply absorbed nutrients from their environment and grew slowly over centuries. To them, the very concept of one creature eating another was disturbing and unnatural. Scattered throughout the room were Zephyrians, their insectoid forms clicking softly as they communicated in subsonic frequencies. Their compound eyes gave them excellent vision, but their homeworld had been peaceful for millions of years. They had evolved from creatures similar to Earth's beetles, but on a world where cooperation and pollination were the primary survival strategies. In the very back corner, almost forgotten by the others, sat Jake Morrison. At 19 years old, he was young even by human standards, and ancient by the standards of most other species who didn't reach intellectual maturity until their 40s or 50s. His brown hair was slightly messy, and his casual clothes stood out among the formal academic robes worn by most students. Jake had been at the academy for 6 months now, part of the first human exchange program. Most students treated him kindly, but distantly, like a curious pet or a young child who had somehow wandered into an adult classroom. They found his enthusiasm charming but naive, his questions simple but earnest. Professor Veltar called the class to attention. His voice carried, the musical quality typical of his species, each word flowing into the next like water over stones. Students, today we begin a new unit in our xenobiology curriculum. We will be studying predator psychology and behavior. A wave of uncomfortable shifting moved through the classroom. Zara's gill slits closed tightly in distress. Kevin retreated, partially into his shell, leaving only his eye stalks visible. Even the usually stoic granite students seemed to compress themselves smaller. I understand this topic makes many of you uncomfortable, Professor Veltar continued, his voice gentle and reassuring. Predation is thankfully rare in our current galactic community. Most member species evolved from herbivores, filter feeders, or energy absorbers. However, it is important that we understand all forms of life, including those that may seem alien to our experiences. Jake leaned forward slightly, genuinely interested. While his classmates showed signs of distress, he seemed curious and engaged. He pulled out his tablet and began taking notes, completely unaware of how different his reaction was from everyone else in the room. Predators, Professor Veltar explained, are creatures that have evolved to hunt and consume other living beings. This behavior shaped their psychology, their physical adaptations, and their social structures in ways that peaceful species often find difficult to comprehend. Zara raised a trembling hand. Professor, why do such creatures exist? Surely evolution would favor cooperation over violence. Professor Veltar nodded approvingly at the question. An excellent observation, Zara. In most stable environments, cooperation does indeed prove more beneficial. However, predation can emerge in environments where resources are scarce, where rapid population growth threatens ecosystem balance, or where environmental pressures create intense competition for survival. He activated his holographic display, showing a generic predator model, sleek, muscular, with sharp teeth and claws. Several students gasped at the image, and one Zephyrian made a distressed clicking sound. Notice the adaptations, Professor Veltar continued. Enhanced sensory organs for detecting prey. Powerful musculature for pursuit or ambush. Weapons such as claws, fangs, or venom for subduing victims. These are the hallmarks of a predatory species. Jake raised his hand casually. Professor, when you say enhanced sensory organs, do you mean compared to their prey species, or compared to non-predators in general? The question surprised Professor Veltar. Most students were too disturbed by the topic to ask technical questions. An interesting distinction, Mr. Morrison. Typically, predators develop enhanced senses compared to their available prey. However, some peaceful species have also evolved sophisticated sensory systems for other purposes: navigation, communication, or environmental monitoring. That makes sense. Jake nodded, scribbling notes. So the enhancement is usually specific to hunting applications rather than just general sensory improvement. Zara turned to stare at Jake in amazement. How could he discuss such a horrible topic so calmly? Kevin's eye stalk swiveled to focus on the human student, trying to understand this strange reaction. Professor Veltar was pleased to have at least one student engaging with the material. Exactly right, Mr. Morrison. Now, beyond physical adaptations, predators also develop specific psychological traits. They must be able to track and pursue prey, often over long distances or extended periods. They must be capable of violence without the emotional distress that such actions would cause in peaceful species. The classroom fell silent except for the soft scratching of Jake's stylus on his tablet. The other students sat frozen, trying to process concepts that seemed fundamentally wrong to their peaceful natures. Tomorrow, Professor Veltar announced, we will observe these principles in action. I have arranged for a live demonstration using a specimen from our research facility. Class dismissed. As students filed out, chattering nervously among themselves, Jake remained seated, reviewing his notes. He was genuinely excited about tomorrow's lesson, completely unaware that his calm interest in predator psychology had already begun to puzzle his classmates and professor alike. The next morning, Classroom 7 Alpha felt different. The usual cheerful chatter was replaced by nervous whispers and anxious movements. Students had arrived early, but many sat as far from the front of the room as possible. Some had even skipped breakfast, their stomachs too unsettled to handle food. Professor Veltar entered carrying a small device that looked like a metal briefcase. His movements were more careful than usual, and his expression was serious. The device in his hands hummed, softly, with contained energy. Jake noticed that several seats were empty. 3 Etherian students had apparently decided not to attend, and 2 of the Zephyrians were missing as well. Those who had come looked pale and nervous. Zara sat rigidly in her chair, her gill slits opening and closing rapidly in a pattern that showed extreme stress. "Students," Professor Veltar began, his musical voice more subdued than usual, "I want to remind you that today's demonstration is completely safe. The specimen is contained within multiple layers of security fields. However, if anyone feels too uncomfortable to continue, you may leave without penalty to your grade." Nobody moved, but Jake could see several students considering the offer. Kevin had retreated so far into his shell that only the tips of his eye stalks were visible. One of the granite students had actually compressed himself into a smaller, denser form. Professor Veltar placed the containment device on his desk and began activating various controls. "The creature we will observe today is called a razor claw. It comes from the Zephyrian homeworld, though I should note that it evolved on a different continent from our Zephyrian classmates. The species has been extinct in the wild for over 3,000 years, but we maintain small populations for research purposes." A Zephyrian student clicked nervously. "Professor, how did they become extinct?" "Environmental changes and competition from more successful species," Professor Veltar replied, diplomatically. He didn't mention that the Zephyrians themselves had systematically eliminated the razor claws once they developed advanced technology, considering them too dangerous to coexist with. The containment device began to glow, and a shimmering energy field appeared in the center of the classroom. It formed a cube about 3 meters on each side, crackling softly with blue light. The field was completely transparent, but everyone could sense the power humming within it. Professor Veltar made a final adjustment to his controls, and something began to materialize inside the containment field. First, there was just a shadow, then a vague shape, and finally, the creature itself became solid and real. The razor claw stood nearly 7 feet tall on powerful hind legs. Its body was covered in dark, mottled scales that seemed to absorb light. Massive shoulders supported arms that ended in claws the length of dinner knives. Its head was angular and predatory, with yellow eyes that seemed to glow with their own light. Rows of sharp teeth were visible even when its mouth was closed. The reaction in the classroom was immediate and dramatic. Zara let out a high-pitched whistle of terror and slapped her hands over her gill slits. 3 students immediately fainted, their bodies hitting the floor with soft thuds. Kevin disappeared completely into his shell with a wet popping sound. The creature moved with fluid grace inside its containment field, testing the boundaries with casual swipes of its claws. Electric sparks flew where its talons met the energy barrier, but the field held firm. The razor claw seemed unconcerned by its imprisonment, moving like a professional athlete warming up for a competition. "Observe the creature's posture and movement," Professor Veltar said, his voice slightly strained as he tried to maintain his professional demeanor while half his class cowered in terror. "Notice how it maintains perfect balance even while exploring its environment. See how its head moves constantly, scanning for threats and opportunities." The razor claw's yellow eyes swept across the classroom, studying each student in turn. When its gaze fell on the Etherian students, they pressed themselves back into their chairs as if trying to melt into the furniture. The granite students had become so compressed they looked like decorative rocks. The remaining Zephyrians had clustered together in the far corner, their compound eyes reflecting the creature's image hundreds of times. But when the Razor Claw's eyes found Jake, something interesting happened. The human student was leaning forward, in his chair, studying the creature with obvious fascination. He was taking careful notes, occasionally pausing to observe a particular movement or behavior. His expression was focused and analytical, like a scientist studying an interesting specimen. The Razor Claw seemed to notice Jake's different reaction. It stopped its casual prowling and turned to face him directly. For a long moment, predator and human regarded each other through the energy field. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if puzzled by this small being who showed no fear. Jake continued taking notes, completely unaware that every other conscious student in the room was staring at him in amazement. How could he be so calm? Didn't he understand what he was looking at? The Razor Claw's primary hunting method was ambush predation, Professor Veltar continued, though his voice wavered slightly as he watched the creature's intense focus on Jake. They would wait in concealment, often for hours before striking, at prey with explosive speed and power. As if responding to the description, the Razor Claw suddenly moved. It sprang forward in a blur of motion, striking the containment field with tremendous force. The barrier held, but the impact sent visible waves of energy rippling across its surface. The sound was like thunder, and sparks flew in all directions. Every student except Jake either screamed, fainted, or tried to hide. Zara fell out of her chair and crawled under her desk. The few Zephyrians who were still conscious scattered like leaves in a storm. Even Professor Veltar took an involuntary step backward. Jake simply looked up from his notes and watched the creature's attack with professional interest. He observed how the Razor Claw had coiled its muscles before striking, how it had calculated the distance and timing, how it immediately prepared for a second attack when the first was blocked. The creature struck again, this time with both claws, extended. Again the barrier held, but the force of the impact made the entire containment system shake. The lights in the classroom flickered, and several students whimpered in terror. Jake raised his hand casually. "Professor, is that typical striking behavior for the species? Or is it showing signs of stress from captivity?" Professor Veltar stared at Jake in complete bewilderment. The rest of the class, those who were still conscious, looked at the human student as if he had grown a second head. Here was a creature that embodied every nightmare their peaceful species had ever imagined, and this young human was asking technical questions about its behavior. The Razor Claw had also noticed Jake's calm reaction. It stopped its attacks on the barrier and moved closer to the side, facing the human student. Its yellow eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made even Professor Veltar uncomfortable. But Jake just continued taking notes, occasionally glancing up to observe the creature's movements and posture. To him, this was simply an interesting lesson in xenobiology. He had no idea that his reaction was unlike anything his classmates had ever witnessed, or that he was about to change how everyone in the room thought about humans forever. The classroom remained in chaos for several minutes after the Razor Claw's explosive demonstration. Students slowly emerged from their hiding places, checking to make sure the containment field was still functioning. Zara crawled out from under her desk, her gill slits still fluttering with panic. Kevin's eye stalks cautiously peeked out from his shell, scanning the room for danger. Professor Veltar worked to restore order, helping the students who had fainted and trying to calm those who were still conscious but terrified. His own hands shook slightly as he adjusted the containment field controls, increasing the power levels to ensure the barrier would hold against any future attacks. Through it all, Jake continued taking notes. He had barely reacted to the creature's violent display, treating it as simply another data point in his observations. While his classmates whispered nervously to each other about the horror they had just witnessed, Jake was sketching the Razor Claw's attack posture and noting the timing of its movements. The Razor Claw had not returned to its casual prowling. Instead, it remained focused on Jake, moving slowly along the edge of the containment field closest to the human student. Its yellow eyes never left Jake's face, and its head tilted at various angles as if trying to understand something that puzzled it greatly. Professor Veltar noticed the creature's behavior and found it deeply unsettling. In all his years of studying predators, he had never seen a razor claw show such sustained interest in a specific individual. Usually, they either ignored observers or showed equal hostility toward everyone present. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Veltar called out, his voice still slightly unsteady from the recent excitement. "Perhaps you could share your observations about this apex predator?" The request caused a ripple of nervous whispers throughout the classroom. Most students couldn't understand why anyone would want to discuss the terrifying creature in detail. Zara made a soft, whimpering sound at the suggestion. Jake looked up from his notes and stood casually, completely unaware of how his calm demeanor contrasted with the fear radiating from his classmates. He glanced at the razor claw, which had stopped moving and was now standing perfectly still, watching him with intense concentration. "Well," Jake began, his voice steady and analytical, "it's definitely a predator, but I'd classify it more as an ambush hunter based on its physical structure. Look at the muscle fiber distribution in its legs. They're built for explosive power rather than sustained running. The tendons are arranged for maximum force output in short bursts." He pointed casually at the creature, which continued to watch him with those glowing yellow eyes. Several students gasped that he would draw the monster's attention so deliberately, and "Those claws," Jake continued, "they're designed for grappling and holding rather than slashing. See how they curve inward? That's perfect for grabbing onto struggling prey and maintaining a grip. The creature probably drops from elevated positions, trees, cliffs, maybe buildings, onto targets below." Professor Veltar found himself nodding, along with Jake's analysis despite his bewilderment. The observations were accurate and showed a sophisticated understanding of predator anatomy. But how could this young human discuss such a terrifying subject so clinically? "The jaw structure is interesting too," Jake added, warming to his topic. "Those teeth aren't designed for tearing meat from bones like you'd see in a scavenger. They're for delivering a killing bite and then swallowing large chunks of prey whole. Probably targets creatures about half its size for optimal efficiency." Zara stared at Jake in complete shock. He was describing the monster's killing methods as if he were discussing the weather. Kevin had extended his eye stalks further from his shell, apparently fascinated despite his terror. The razor claw moved closer to the edge of the containment field, pressing its face almost against the energy barrier. Its breath fogged the field's surface as it studied Jake with an intensity that made Professor Veltar increasingly uncomfortable. "What's particularly interesting," Jake continued, "is the sensory setup. Those eyes are clearly adapted for low light conditions, probably most active during dawn and dusk hours when prey species are transitioning between day and night activities. The pupils can dilate much wider than most diurnal hunters." Jake paused to make another sketch in his notebook, completely ignoring the way the massive predator was staring at him. The nostrils are positioned for maximum airflow analysis, and look at the size of those ear canals. This thing probably hunts as much by sound and smell as by sight. Professor Veltar realized his mouth was hanging open and quickly closed it. Jake's analysis was not only accurate, but demonstrated a level of predator knowledge that exceeded what most xenobiology students learned in their entire academic careers. But it's got some obvious weaknesses, too, Jake added casually. Those eyes adapted for low light would be severely compromised by bright illumination. Flash a strong light at this thing and it would be temporarily blinded. The claws look impressive, but they're not retractable. See how they're worn at the tips? That means they get dulled from constant contact with hard surfaces. The human student gestured toward the creature's torso. And look at its breathing pattern. It's already showing signs of stress just from pacing around in that small space. The chest expansion indicates poor cardiovascular efficiency. This is a sprinter, not a marathon runner. Tire it out, and it becomes much less dangerous. As if responding to Jake's commentary, the razor claw began breathing more heavily, its chest rising and falling in the rapid pattern Jake had just described. The creature's yellow eyes remained locked on the human, but now there seemed to be something different in its gaze. Not just curiosity, but what might have been recognition. The classroom had fallen completely silent. Even the students who had been whispering nervously to each other were now staring at Jake in amazement. How could he not only remain calm in the presence of such a terrifying predator, but actually critique its abilities as if he were reviewing a piece of homework? Professor Veltar struggled to process what he was witnessing. In 2 centuries of teaching, he had never encountered a student who could analyze a live apex predator with such detached professionalism. Most peaceful species found the very concept of predation disturbing on a fundamental level, yet this young human was discussing killing techniques and hunting strategies as if they were perfectly normal topics of conversation. The razor claw suddenly sat down, lowering its massive form to the floor of the containment field. It continued to watch Jake, but the aggressive tension had left its posture. Professor Veltar had never seen the creature behave this way before. It almost seemed respectful. Jake finished his notes and looked up at Professor Veltar expectantly, waiting for the next part of the lesson. He had no idea that his casual analysis had left the entire class speechless, or that his calm reaction to the apex predator had raised questions about human nature that would soon shake the foundations of everything his classmates thought they knew about their species. Professor Veltar stood motionless for a long moment, his large, dark eyes studying Jake with the same intensity the razor claw was showing. The Etherean's translucent skin had taken on a slightly different hue, indicating deep thought and confusion. In all his centuries of teaching xenobiology, he had never encountered a reaction quite like this. The other students remained frozen in their seats, torn between their terror of the contained predator and their amazement at Jake's casual analysis. Zara had managed to climb back into her chair, but her gill slits continued their rapid, nervous fluttering. The granite students had relaxed slightly from their compressed forms, their curiosity beginning to overcome their fear. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Veltar said slowly, his musical voice carrying a note of genuine puzzlement, "your analysis is remarkably comprehensive. Tell me, what do you see when you look at this predator?" Jake glanced back at the razor claw, which was still sitting calmly on the floor of its containment field. The creature's posture had shifted from aggressive alertness to something that almost resembled patient waiting. Its yellow eyes tracked Jake's movements, but without the hostile intensity it had shown toward the other students. "Honestly, Jake," said with a slight shrug. "I see a pretty standard mid-tier predator. It's well adapted for its niche, but nothing too extraordinary. Probably takes down prey twice its size when it's healthy, and has the element of surprise, but it's got limitations that would make it vulnerable to a prepared opponent." The casual dismissal of the terrifying creature sent another wave of shocked whispers through the classroom. Kevin's eye stalks extended further from his shell, swiveling to focus on Jake with obvious disbelief. Professor Veltar felt his academic curiosity overriding his caution. "You describe it as standard and mid-tier. This suggests you have a reference point for comparison. What would you consider a more formidable predator?" Jake thought for a moment, tapping his stylus against his tablet. "Well, this thing is specialized for ambush hunting in a specific environment. A more dangerous predator would be something with greater versatility. Better endurance, more intelligence, maybe pack hunting abilities. This razor claw is impressive in its element, but it's pretty limited outside of that." The razor claw tilted its head at Jake's words, and Professor Veltar could swear the creature understood it was being evaluated. The academic in him was fascinated, but something deeper was beginning to worry him about this entire interaction. "The breathing inefficiency is a major weakness," Jake continued, warming to the analysis. "Look at how its respiratory rate has increased just from sitting still. This suggests its homeworld had very specific atmospheric conditions, probably higher oxygen content. In a standard galactic environment, it's already operating at reduced capacity." Zara raised a trembling hand. "Jake, how do you know so much about predator anatomy? This is supposed to be new material for all of us." Jake looked genuinely surprised by the question. "I guess some of it just seems obvious? I mean, form follows function, right? When you look at how something is built, you can figure out what it was designed to do." Professor Veltar's confusion was growing deeper. Jake's analysis demonstrated not just academic knowledge, but intuitive understanding of predator psychology and tactics. It was the kind of insight that usually came from direct experience or extensive study, not casual observation. "Mr. Morrison," the professor said carefully, "when you analyze this creature's hunting methods, you speak with considerable certainty. Have you perhaps studied similar species in your previous education?" "Not exactly," Jake replied, "but the principles are pretty universal, aren't they? Efficient energy use, target selection based on risk-reward ratios, environmental adaptation for maximum advantage. It's just logical problem-solving." The human student looked back at the razor claw, which continued to watch him with those glowing yellow eyes. Instead of showing fear or even respect for the dangerous predator, Jake regarded it with what could only be described as professional interest. "The really fascinating thing," Jake added, "is how this species probably went extinct. Based on its specializations, I'd guess it was outcompeted by more adaptable predators or eliminated by prey species that developed better defensive strategies." Professor Veltar felt a chill run through his translucent skin. Jake was discussing the extinction of an apex predator as if it were a natural and expected outcome. Most peaceful species viewed extinction as a tragedy, especially the violent elimination of one species by another. "You suggest that prey species might have eliminated their predators?" the professor asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Sure," Jake nodded casually. "Once a prey species develops sufficient intelligence and technology, the predator-prey relationship shifts dramatically. The former prey becomes the dominant force, and the predators either adapt to a new niche or disappear entirely." The classroom fell silent, except for the soft humming of the containment field. Jake's matter-of-fact description of species warfare, was delivered with the same calm tone he might use to discuss the weather. The other students stared at him with growing unease. The razor claw suddenly stood up, moving with fluid grace to press itself against the containment barrier closest to Jake. For a moment, predator and human locked eyes across the energy field. The creature's breathing had steadied, and its posture showed none of the aggressive tension it had displayed earlier. Instead of backing down or showing any sign of intimidation, Jake simply nodded at the creature with what looked like acknowledgement. Between equals, the gesture was so natural and unconscious that Jake himself seemed unaware he had done it. Professor Veltar watched this exchange with growing alarm. The razor claw was responding to Jake in a way he had never seen before. The creature wasn't, showing the typical reactions of a caged predator: frustration, aggression, or territorial display. Instead, it seemed to be communicating. "Class," Professor Veltar said, his voice slightly strained. "I think we should take a brief recess. Please remain in your seats while I make some adjustments to the containment system." But he wasn't adjusting anything. Instead, he activated his communication device and sent an urgent message to Dr. Lisa Park, the human professor who served as Jake's academic advisor. The message was brief but urgent. "Please come to Classroom 7 Alpha immediately. I need to speak with you about your student's background." As Professor Veltar waited for Dr. Park's response, he watched Jake continue to observe the razor claw with calm, analytical interest. The young human was still taking notes, sketching behavioral patterns and recording observations as if he were studying a laboratory specimen rather than one of the galaxy's most feared predators. The razor claw remained pressed against the containment field, its yellow eyes never leaving Jake's face. For the first time in his long academic career, Professor Veltar began to wonder if there was something about humans that the galactic community had failed to understand. Dr. Lisa Park arrived at Classroom 7 Alpha within minutes of receiving Professor Veltar's urgent message. She paused in the doorway, quickly taking in the scene before her. The alien students were clustered together in obvious distress, many still showing signs of shock and fear. The containment field hummed with energy in the center of the room, holding what was clearly a dangerous predator. And there was Jake, sitting calmly in his usual spot, taking notes as if this were any other ordinary lesson. Dr. Park was a xenobiology specialist herself, one of the first humans to join the Academy's faculty. At 45, she had spent the last decade studying the peaceful species of the galactic community and serving as a cultural liaison for the few human students who attended the Academy. She immediately recognized the signs of a classroom full of herbivorous species who had just encountered something far outside their comfort zone. "I see you're studying the razor claw," she said cheerfully, her tone deliberately light and casual. "Jake, remind me, how does this compare to the predators from your homework assignment last week?" Professor Veltar's translator unit caught the words, but the meaning seemed to confuse him. Homework assignment about predators? What kind of educational system would give students assignments about such disturbing creatures? Jake looked up from his notes with genuine enthusiasm. "Well, it's definitely more impressive than a mountain lion, but probably less dangerous than a grizzly. Bear in close combat. The bite force looks comparable to a big cat, maybe 1,200 psi. Nothing like a crocodile, though. Those can hit over 3,000 psi. The alien student stared at Jake in growing confusion and horror. Mountain lion? Grizzly bear? Crocodile? The translator units were working, but the context made no sense. These sounded like names for actual creatures, not fictional monsters from entertainment media. Professor Veltar's gill slits began fluttering rapidly. "Mr. Morrison, are these creatures from human entertainment programs? Fantasy stories, perhaps?" Dr. Park and Jake exchanged a quick glance. In that moment, Dr. Park realized that the galactic community's understanding of Earth and humanity was even more limited than she had thought. The peaceful species had apparently classified Earth based on humanity's behavior in space, cooperative, diplomatic, and civilized, without truly understanding what kind of world had produced such beings. "Professor," Dr. Park said gently, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about Jake's homeworld classification." She moved to the front of the classroom and activated her own holographic display unit. "With your permission, I'd like to provide some context for Jake's observations." Professor Veltar nodded numbly, still trying to process the implications of Jake's casual mention of creatures with bite forces that exceeded anything in the Academy's database of known predators. Dr. Park began with a simple image. Earth as seen from space, a blue and green marble floating in the darkness. It looked peaceful and beautiful, much like the homeworlds of most galactic species. "This is Earth," she announced. "Jake's homeworld. Population, approximately 8 billion humans." Zara raised a trembling hand. 8 billion? How is that possible? Most worlds can barely support a few 100 million sapient beings without ecological collapse. That's because most worlds don't have competition driving rapid evolutionary adaptation, Dr. Park replied. Earth is what we call a death world, a planet where survival requires constant adaptation and competition. She changed the display to show a great white shark breaching the surface of the ocean, its massive jaws filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. The classroom erupted in gasps and horrified chittering as students recoiled from the image. "This is a great white shark," Dr. Park continued calmly. "They grow up to 20 feet long and have a bite force of over 4,000 psi. They're one of Earth's marine predators." Kevin had retreated so far into his shell that only the very tips of his eye stalks were visible. The nautiloid species had evolved in deep oceans, but their world had never produced anything remotely like the monster on the display. Professor Veltar stared at the image in disbelief. "This creature, it actually exists on your homeworld?" "Oh, yes," Jake nodded casually. "Though they're not really that dangerous to humans. Shark attacks are pretty rare. You're more likely to be struck by lightning." The casual dismissal of a 4,000 psi predator as not really that dangerous sent another wave of shocked silence through the classroom. Dr. Park continued the presentation, showing image after image of Earth's wildlife. A Siberian tiger, stalking through snow, its orange and black stripes providing perfect camouflage. A grizzly bear standing 9 feet tall on its hind legs, massive claws extended. A saltwater crocodile floating motionlessly in murky water, only its eyes visible above the surface. With each new image, the alien students seemed to shrink further into themselves. The granite students had compressed into forms so dense they looked like decorative stones. The Etherian students were hyperventilating through their gill slits. Even the usually stoic Zephyrians were clicking frantically in their subsonic distress frequency. "These are Jake's neighbors," Dr. Park explained, with matter-of-fact calm. "The creatures he grew up learning about in elementary school." She showed them African lions hunting in coordinated packs, their teamwork and strategy evident in every movement. Venomous snakes that could kill with a single bite. Army ants that moved in swarms of millions, capable of stripping flesh from bone in minutes. You see, Jake added helpfully, Earth is what you'd call a competitive environment. Pretty much everything there is either trying to eat something else, avoid being eaten, or both. Humans didn't become the dominant species because we're the strongest or fastest. We became dominant because we're the most persistent and adaptable. Professor Veltar felt his world view crumbling around him. His voice came out as barely a whisper. You mean you evolved alongside all these apex predators? Not just alongside them, Jake corrected with a slight smile. We hunted them. That's why most of the really dangerous megafauna went extinct. Humans were just too good at persistence. Hunting and tool use. The razor claw, which had been quietly observing this entire exchange, suddenly moved closer to the containment field. Its yellow eyes were fixed on Jake with what could only be described as recognition. For the first time since its capture, the creature seemed calm, almost respectful. Dr. Park noticed the creature's behavior and nodded approvingly. Even apex predators recognize their own kind, she murmured, too quietly for the translator units to catch. But Professor Veltar was beginning to understand. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Jake's casual analysis of the razor claw, his instinctive understanding of predator psychology, his complete lack of fear in the presence of a creature that terrified every other student in the room. Mr. Morrison, Professor Veltar said slowly, what exactly are humans? Jake looked genuinely surprised by Professor Veltar's question. He glanced at Dr. Park, who gave him an encouraging nod. It was clear that the time for gentle cultural exchange had passed, and the truth needed to be told. Well, Jake began slowly, I guess we're persistence predators? We're omnivores, technically, so we eat plants too. But when you look at our evolutionary adaptations... He paused, considering how to explain something that seemed obvious to him. Dr. Park stepped forward to help. Professor, let me show you what Jake means. She activated her holographic display again, but this time the image was of a human skeleton. The alien students leaned forward despite their fear, studying the bone structure with academic interest. Notice the forward-facing eyes, Dr. Park pointed out. That's for depth perception during hunting. The bipedal stance freed up our hands for tool use and throwing. Most importantly, look at the leg structure. It's optimized for endurance running, not speed. She changed the image to show a human in motion, muscles highlighted to show the biomechanics of running. Humans are persistence hunters. We don't outrun our prey in a sprint. We run them to exhaustion over hours or even days. Zara raised a trembling hand. You chase other creatures until they collapse from exhaustion? It's called persistence hunting, Jake explained matter-of-factly. Early humans could track an antelope for 8 to 10 hours, maintaining a steady pace until the animal overheated and collapsed. Then we'd move in for the kill. The casual description of methodical predation sent another wave of horror through the classroom. Kevin had disappeared completely into his shell, and several Etherian students looked like they might faint again. Professor Veltar stared at the human skeleton on the display. Everything Jake had said about the razor claw suddenly made sense, in a new and terrifying context. The human wasn't analyzing the predator as an outside observer. He was evaluating it as a competitor. But that's not the worst part, Dr. Park continued, her tone still academically neutral. Show them the throwing demonstration, Jake. Jake stood up and picked up a small piece of chalk from the professor's desk. Humans have the most accurate throwing ability of any known species. We can hit moving targets at ranges up to 100 meters. He casually tossed the chalk across the room, where it hit a specific point on the wall with perfect accuracy. The simple demonstration somehow seemed more terrifying than all the images of Earth's predators combined. The alien students were looking at Jake's hands, those same hands that had been taking notes and gesturing casually, as if seeing them for the first time. Early humans could bring down flying birds with stones, Dr. Park explained. We developed spear-throwing techniques that could kill creatures much larger than ourselves from safe distances. But the real advantage was our social cooperation. She showed an image of early humans hunting a mammoth, working together with coordinated tactics and primitive weapons. The massive creature was surrounded by small figures, but the outcome was clear. The humans were winning. Pack hunting, Jake added. Humans learned to work together to take down prey that no individual could handle alone. We developed language specifically to coordinate group hunts. We made plans, set traps, and used tools to multiply our effectiveness. The razor claw pressed itself against the containment field, its yellow eyes fixed on Jake with what was clearly recognition. The creature understood what it was looking at. Another apex predator, perhaps more dangerous than itself. Professor Veltar found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. How long did this hunting behavior continue? Depends how you count it, Jake replied thoughtfully. Persistence hunting was our primary survival strategy for about 2 million years. We only stopped when we developed agriculture about 10,000 years ago. Even then, humans continued hunting for sport and food until very recently. 10,000 years? Zara's voice was high with disbelief. You stopped being predators only 10,000 years ago? Dr. Park shook her head. We didn't stop being predators, Zara. We just stopped needing to hunt for survival. The instincts and abilities are still there. She changed the display to show modern human activities: rock climbing, marathon running, competitive sports. Humans still demonstrate predator traits in our recreational activities. We climb mountains because our ancestors climbed cliffs to reach prey. We run marathons because we evolved for endurance pursuit. We compete in teams because pack hunting required cooperation. Jake nodded enthusiastically. And we still have the predator psychology. Humans love strategy games, puzzle solving, and competitive activities. We're naturally good at reading body language, detecting deception, and predicting behavior. All hunting skills. The classroom was completely silent, except for the humming of the containment field. The alien students were trying to process the revelation that their friendly, helpful classmate was a member of what might be the most successful predator species in galactic history. Professor Veltar looked at Jake with new eyes. The young humans. Casual confidence, his analytical mind, his complete lack of fear in the presence of danger. It all made sense now. Jake wasn't brave or unusual for a human. He was normal. Mr. Morrison, the professor said slowly, when you look at the razor claw, you see a mid-tier predator. What would you consider a top-tier predator? Jake glanced at the creature in the containment field, then back at Professor Veltar. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his perspective might be different from his classmates. Well, he said carefully, I guess that would be anything that could hunt the hunters. Something smart enough to track persistent predators, adaptable enough to survive in any environment, and social enough to coordinate complex strategies. He paused, looking around the room at his terrified classmates. Something like, well, like humans, I suppose. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. The alien students stared at Jake with a mixture of awe and terror. They were beginning to understand that they weren't just studying predator psychology. They were sitting in a classroom with an actual apex predator who had been politely pretending to be just another student. The razor claw, still pressed against the containment field, made a sound none of them had heard before. It was almost like a purr, but deeper and more complex. Dr. Park recognized it from her research. It was a sound razor claws made when acknowledging a superior predator. Professor Veltar finally understood why the galactic community had been so eager to include humans in their alliance. They hadn't been welcoming a new peaceful species. They had been diplomatically managing a potential threat that could hunt anything in the galaxy, including them. The revelation about human nature settled over the classroom like a heavy blanket. Students who had spent months treating Jake like a curious but harmless pet were now seeing him in an entirely different light. Every casual gesture, every friendly smile, every helpful offer to share notes took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of apex predator psychology. Zara was the first to find her voice. "But Jake," she said, her gill slits fluttering with confusion, "you're so kind. You help us with our studies, you share your food, you never show aggression. How can you be a predator?" Jake looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why would being a predator make me unfriendly? Predation is just a feeding strategy. It doesn't mean you have to be cruel or antisocial." Dr. Park nodded approvingly. "This is actually a common misconception among peaceful species. You assume that predators must be inherently violent or hostile, but successful predators are often highly social and cooperative within their own groups." She changed the holographic display to show wolves hunting together, their coordination and teamwork evident in every movement. Pack hunters like wolves and humans developed strong social bonds because cooperation improved survival chances. A human alone is dangerous, but humans working together are nearly unstoppable. Professor Veltar was beginning to understand the implications. "You're saying that human cooperation isn't despite their predatory nature, but because of it?" "Exactly," Jake said, warming to the explanation. Early humans who could work together effectively were more successful hunters. They got more food, had healthier offspring, and passed on their cooperative traits. Over millions of years, this created a species that's both highly predatory and highly social. Kevin's eye stalks emerged slightly from his shell. "But if humans are such effective predators, why aren't you hunting us?" The question sent a nervous ripple through the classroom. It was the fear that had been lurking beneath the surface since the revelation began. If humans were apex predators, what did that mean for the other species in the galaxy? Jake looked genuinely shocked by the suggestion. "Why would I hunt you? You're not food and you're not threatening me." Humans learned a long time ago that cooperation with other intelligent species is more beneficial than conflict. Dr. Park expanded on Jake's explanation. Human predatory instincts evolved for hunting animals, not sapient beings. When humans developed higher intelligence and encountered other intelligent species, those same cooperative instincts that made us successful pack hunters made us successful diplomats. She showed images of human settlements throughout history, demonstrating how cooperation and trade had always been preferred over conflict when dealing with other human groups. Humans learned that peaceful coexistence with neighbors was more profitable than constant warfare. We applied the same logic to interstellar relations. Professor Veltar was taking careful notes, his academic mind racing to process these new insights. "So human aggression is controllable?" "It's contextual," Jake explained. Humans can be incredibly dangerous when threatened or when protecting others, but we're not mindlessly violent. We developed complex social rules about when violence is appropriate and when it isn't. The Razor Claw had been listening to this entire exchange with obvious interest. Its posture had shifted from the aggressive alertness it had shown earlier to something that looked almost like respect. The creature seemed to understand that it was in the presence of a superior predator who had chosen restraint over dominance. Zara raised another trembling hand. Jake, when you analyzed the Razor Claw's weaknesses, you were thinking about how to defeat it, weren't you? Jake considered the question carefully. I was analyzing its capabilities, yes. That's what you do when you encounter an unknown predator. You assess threats, identify weaknesses, and plan responses. It's automatic for humans. The casual admission that Jake had been unconsciously planning how to kill the terrifying creature in front of them sent another wave of shocked silence through the classroom. But that doesn't mean I wanted to hurt it, Jake added quickly, noticing his classmates' reactions. It's just pattern recognition, like how you might automatically calculate the nutritional value of plants you see, or how a nautiloid might instinctively map water currents. Humans automatically evaluate potential, threats, and opportunities. Dr. Park decided to address the elephant in the room directly. Students, I understand this is disturbing news. You've been taught that predation is evil or unnatural, but predators serve important ecological functions. They control population growth, eliminate weak or diseased individuals, and drive evolutionary adaptation. She changed the display to show Earth's ecosystem in balance, with predators and prey coexisting in a complex web of relationships. Humans didn't destroy Earth's biosphere, we became part of it. We learned to manage our predatory impulses for the greater good. Professor Veltar was beginning to see the bigger picture. This explains human behavior in the galactic community. Your species joined not as supplicants seeking protection, but as equals offering cooperation. More than equals, Jake said quietly. When humans first made contact with galactic civilization, we were probably the most dangerous species you'd ever encountered. But instead of conquest, we chose partnership. The weight of that statement settled over the room. Every species in the galactic community had been welcomed because they posed no threat to existing members. Humans had been welcomed despite being capable of hunting any other species in the galaxy. Kevin emerged further from his shell, his curiosity overcoming his fear. How do humans control such dangerous instincts? Education and social conditioning, Dr. Park replied. Human children are taught from an early age that intelligence and cooperation are more valuable than strength and aggression. We channeled our competitive instincts into art, science, sports, and exploration. Jake nodded enthusiastically. That's why humans love challenges and exploration so much. We need something to hunt, so we hunt knowledge, or we hunt solutions to problems, or we hunt new experiences. Space exploration is just persistence hunting applied to the universe. The Razor Claw made that deep purring sound again, and for the first time since its capture, it lay down in a relaxed position. The creature had been in the presence of dozens of researchers and students over the years, but it had never before encountered another apex predator who had evolved beyond the need for violence. Professor Veltar looked around his classroom at the mix of terrified and fascinated alien students, then at Jake, who was still taking notes with the same casual interest he had shown from the beginning. "Class," the professor said slowly, "I believe we need to completely revise our understanding of predator psychology, and perhaps our understanding of humanity as well.